The air in the Black Hills land office in Custer City was thick with the dust of unsettled claims and the thin, sour smell of desperation. Elspeth Monroe felt it settle on her skin, a familiar grit. Across the scarred oak desk, Silas Kane sat with his back ramrod straight, his hat resting on his knee. For 3 years, he had been nothing more to her than a fence post on the wrong side of a creek, a stubborn shadow on the edge of her property. Mr. Davies, a man whose spectacles seemed perpetually fogged by the complexities of federal surveying, cleared his throat. "So you see the predicament." He tapped a freshly inked plat map. A cruel red line, representing the official new boundary, bisected both their homesteads. Worse, it ran straight down the center of Rapid Creek, the very artery of their long and bitter dispute. Neither parcel, as it stands, is viable under the Homestead Act. Not enough arable land on either side of the waterway to be patented. Elspeth's hands, resting in her lap, clenched into fists inside her worn wool gloves. Everything she had, everything her late husband Robert had broken his back for, was tied up in that land, that water. "One of you must buy the other out," Davies continued, his tone suggesting he knew the impossibility of the statement. Silas Kane finally spoke, his voice low and even, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "With what?" It wasn't a question so much as a flat declaration of fact. Elspeth had 2 milking cows, a small flock of chickens, and just enough cash put away to see her through a harsh winter, provided it wasn't too harsh. She knew Silas, a former infantryman who'd come west to escape the ghosts of the war, was in no better a position. Davies sighed, polishing his glasses with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "There is another option. A legal remedy, you might say. The government encourages it, in fact. Consolidates claims, strengthens settlements." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the small room. "You could merge the claims. File a joint patent." Elspeth stared at him. "A partnership." "A marriage," Davies corrected softly. "A legal union would consolidate the 2 160-acre parcels into a single 320-acre claim. A strong, viable homestead with the creek running right through the heart of it." The silence that followed was absolute. Elspeth looked at Silas Kane. His face was unreadable, carved from the same granite as the surrounding hills. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met hers. There was no warmth in them, but there was no deceit either. They were the eyes of a man who looked at a problem and sought only the solution, however unpalatable. She had spent 3 years seeing him as an adversary, a thief, trying to steal her water. Now, the United States government was telling her to marry him. She thought of the alternative, packing her wagon, admitting defeat, and heading back east to live on the charity of a sister she hadn't spoken to in a decade. Pride, a cold and stubborn thing, rose in her throat. She had not survived a Dakota winter alone to be chased off by a surveyor's red ink. "It would be a business arrangement," she said, her voice tight. The words were for herself, as much as for the 2 men in the room. "A deed in 2 names, nothing more." Silas Kane gave a single, sharp nod. "The land is the thing. That's all." Mr. Davies produced the necessary papers with an alacrity that suggested he'd anticipated this outcome. They signed their names, Elspeth Monroe, Silas Kane, on the line, the scratch of the pen the only sound. It was not a vow. It was a contract. A grim treaty signed on the field of a battle neither of them had won. His moving in was a quiet invasion. He did not bring much: a military-issue footlocker, a bedroll, his rifle, and a small box of tools that were clearly well cared for. Elspeth's cabin was small but tidy, a testament to her solitary efficiency. His presence immediately shrank the space. He was taller than she'd realized, broader in the shoulder. He seemed to fill every corner he wasn't in. They established the rules without speaking them. He took the cot by the hearth, rising before dawn to tend to the livestock and chop wood. She maintained the house, the cooking, the garden. They ate their meals in a silence thick with unspoken history, the scrape of forks on tin plates the only conversation. He was, she noted with a grudging respect, an indefatigable worker. The woodpile grew to a height she'd never managed on her own. The loose hinge on the barn door was fixed before she even had a chance to mention it. He moved with a steady, unhurried purpose, his actions as spare and direct as his speech. She watched him. It became a habit, an involuntary study. She watched his hands calloused and capable as he repaired a piece of tack. She watched the line of his back as he scythed the tall grass in the meadow, a rhythmic swing that spoke of years of hard labor. He never sang, never whistled. He simply worked. One afternoon, she found him by the disputed creek, staring into the water. He was not on his side, or her side, but stood right in the middle, the cold water swirling around his boots. He was holding a smooth gray stone, turning it over and over in his palm. He looked up and saw her watching from the porch. For a moment, she thought he might speak of their past grievances, but he just gave that small, economical nod and tucked the stone into his pocket. He was a man who kept things. The tension between them was not one of anger anymore, but of proximity. The accidental brush of his arm against hers as they passed in the narrow space between the table and the stove sent a jolt through her that was entirely unwelcome. She learned the sound of his breathing in the dark, a slow, steady rhythm that was somehow more intimate than any conversation. He was a constant, solid presence in her life, and she did not know what to do with the feeling of security it brought her. It felt like a betrayal of her own hard-won independence. The first snow came early that year, a fine dusting in late October that melted by noon. But a month later, a true blizzard descended from the north, a wall of white that erased the world. For 4 days, the wind howled a ceaseless, mournful song, and the snow piled in drifts against the cabin door. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the small room, the fire in the hearth, and the two of them. The silence, once merely awkward, became charged. There was nowhere to go to escape each other's presence. On the 3rd day, the monotony was broken by Silas attempting to make coffee. He was clumsy in the kitchen, his large hands ill-suited for the delicate work of the grinder. He spilled half the beans on the floor. As he bent to sweep them up with a frustrated sigh, he knocked a tin of flour off the shelf. It burst open, coating him, the floor, and the nearby woodbox in a cloud of fine, white powder. He stood there, frozen, looking like a bewildered ghost. A fine dusting of flour clung to his eyelashes and settled in the lines around his mouth. Elspeth stared, and then a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years bubbled up and escaped. A laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, unrestrained peal of laughter that made her stomach ache. Silas looked at her, his expression of shock slowly melting into something else. A faint smile touched his lips, a rare and surprising sight. "It seems I'm better suited to fighting the elements outside," he said, a dry humor in his voice she'd never heard before. The laughter broke something between them. That evening, as he sat by the fire, he pulled a piece of cottonwood and a small knife from his pocket. He began to carve, his hands moving with a surprising grace. She watched the shavings fall to the hearth as a shape began to emerge from the wood. It was a bird, a tiny, perfect meadowlark with its head cocked as if listening for a song. He worked for hours, his focus absolute. In his concentration, the harsh lines of his face softened. She saw not the stubborn neighbor or the silent stranger, but a man of deep and quiet patience. A man who could create something delicate from a rough piece of wood. She looked at the bird taking shape in his hands, and then she looked at him, really looked at him. The arrangement had been about land, about survival, but sitting there, in the warm, firelit cabin, cocooned by the storm, she felt the foundation of their practical bargain shift. The feeling in her chest was no longer irritation or anxiety. It was a slow, terrifying, and unmistakable thaw. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. The sun on the snow was blinding. They spent the day digging out, working together in a comfortable rhythm that had become their new normal. The shared labor felt different now, less a division of chores and more a joint effort. That afternoon, as the sun began to sink, casting long blue shadows across the snow, they stood by the barn, surveying their work. The air was still and cold, so clean it stung the lungs. Silas looked out over the consolidated claim, their claim. He was quiet for a long time. Elspeth waited, a strange anticipation fluttering in her chest. "When I first filed on my piece," he said, his voice low, not looking at her, "I thought of it as just acreage, a place to be, away from things." He paused, kicking at a drift with the toe of his boot. "But this, standing here now, it feels more like a home with you in it, Elspeth." It was not a declaration. It was a simple statement of fact, offered as quietly as he did everything else. He had laid a truth at her feet, as plain and solid as one of his hand-split logs. He did not press, did not wait for an answer. He simply gave her the truth and went to tend to the horses, leaving her alone with the vast, quiet landscape and the echo of his words. She stood there until the cold seeped through her coat, her mind racing. A home.